Horror story. The cemetery lay at the edge of town, old and largely forgotten, a place where moss crept over tombstones, and the names carved in granite were worn to a soft blur. People hardly visited anymore, save for the occasional mourner or the rare passerby who took the shortcut through the gravestones to shave a few minutes off their walk home. The air there always seemed a bit colder, a bit more stagnant, as if the lives resting beneath the earth were reaching up, slowing time itself. Even the trees seemed to droop, their branches hanging low as though weighed down by centuries of silence. One overcast afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the headstones, a man named Owen found himself taking that very shortcut. He was heading home from work, his mind preoccupied with the stress of a deadline that loomed too close. The evening was damp, a slight mist rising off the ground, and the cemetery took on an eerie quality, the fog swirling around his feet with each step. Owen had never felt particularly uneasy in graveyards. They were just places to him, quiet patches of land, and this one was no different, until that day. As he passed row upon row of gravestones, something strange caught his attention. A stone about 20 feet away stood out because it was moving. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps an animal scurrying behind it, causing it to sway. He stopped and squinted through the gathering mist. No, it wasn't his imagination. The gravestone was vibrating just slightly, but definitely moving as if an unseen hand were shaking it from below. Owen's heart picked up a beat, but he convinced himself it had to be something perfectly rational. Perhaps a small earthquake or some sort of underground tremor, he reasoned, though he hadn't felt any shaking underfoot. His curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself stepping off the main path, moving slowly toward the gravestone. As he drew closer, the vibration grew stronger, and he realized that it wasn't just moving. It was producing a faint, almost rhythmic sound, like a muffled voice whispering from beneath the soil. He stopped just a foot away from the stone, leaning in to listen, his skin prickling with a strange sensation somewhere between fascination and fear. The sound was unmistakably a voice, but it was garbled, as if filtered through layers of earth, faint yet strangely persistent. His breath caught as he leaned in closer, straining to hear what it was saying. The voice was faint, but he could make out some words, fragments that sent chills down his spine. Owen, Owen. He jerked back, his heart pounding against his ribs, the cold grip of fear tightening around him. How could it know his name? It was impossible. The voice, distorted yet unmistakable, was calling to him, saying his name with a strange familiarity, as though it had been waiting there in silence for him all along. He looked around, half expecting to see someone playing a prank, a speaker hidden behind one of the gravestones, maybe even a trick of the wind. But there was nothing, just him and the whispering gravestone. Frozen in place, he felt his mind racing, trying to piece together some reasonable explanation. But the voice called to him again, more insistent this time. Owen, come closer, it murmured, each word drawn out, a low and hollow invitation that felt like it was crawling into his ears and settling in his mind. It sounded familiar. There was something in that voice, something that reminded him of a memory he couldn't quite place. He took a shaky step backward, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, his skin prickling with an icy fear. Without thinking, he turned and began to walk away quickly, his footsteps breaking the silence of the cemetery. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, that the voice was still whispering to him, even as he moved farther and farther away. Every few steps, he glanced back, half expecting to see something emerging from the ground, something unspeakable reaching out to him. But there was nothing there, just the gravestones standing silent and unmoving as they always had. By the time he left the cemetery, his heart was racing, his pulse thundering in his ears. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself it was all in his head, some twisted illusion brought on by fatigue and stress. But the voice lingered in his memory, replaying over and over, as clear as if it were still whispering in his ear. That night, he lay in bed, the silence of his apartment oppressive, too thick, too still. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the wind outside his window, seemed to take on a sinister tone, as if the voice from the cemetery had followed him home. He told himself he was imagining things, that the mind often plays tricks on you after a scare. But just as he was finally drifting off on the edge of sleep, he heard it again. Owen? It was faint, a whisper from somewhere beyond the walls, as if it were echoing from the cemetery miles away. He bolted upright, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his eyes scanning the dark room. It couldn't be real. He must have been dreaming. But the voice continued, soft and unyielding, a low hum that seemed to creep into every corner of his mind. The next day, he told himself he would avoid the cemetery, that he'd stick to the main road home and forget about the strange experience. But even as he tried to push it out of his mind, he found himself haunted by the voice, by the memory of his name spoken from beneath the earth. At work he was distracted, barely able to concentrate on the simplest tasks. The voice seemed to linger in his thoughts, no longer contained by the cemetery but following him wherever he went, a constant, unsettling presence. As the week wore on, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer confined to the edges of his mind but seemed to be invading his very reality, as if they were seeping in from some other world. He'd hear it at the strangest moments. While walking through the grocery store, his name would echo softly over the murmur of other shoppers. While waiting at a crosswalk, it would drift through the noise of passing cars. And each time he would turn, hoping to catch sight of the source, but there was nothing. Just empty air and the vague, lingering dread that he was being followed by something he couldn't see. His friends noticed the change in him, the way he seemed distant, distracted, his eyes darting around as though searching for something unseen. When they asked him about it, he dismissed their concern, brushing it off as stress from work, as though admitting the truth might make it even more real. He tried to drown out the voice with music, blasting his headphones to full volume, but still, beneath the blaring noise, he could hear it, his name whispered again and again like a relentless chant. And though he tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that it was all in his head, a part of him knew he couldn't escape it. Owen spent his days in a fog of dread, his nights plagued by whispers that seemed to creep out from the shadows. Each time he closed his eyes, he could hear it, his name, soft but insistent, drawing him back to the cemetery. He tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with everything he could think of, loud music, endless cups of coffee, even sleeping with the lights on. But the whispers persisted, growing louder with each passing day, as if the very air around him was infected with the voice that called his name. It became clear that this wasn't something he could escape, and it haunted his every waking moment. One particularly sleepless night, after hours of tossing and turning, he snapped. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly glancing over his shoulder, feeling the presence of something he couldn't see but could definitely feel. It was a sensation like ice-cold fingers crawling up his spine, a weight pressing on him, dragging him closer to madness. And so, in the dead of night, he decided he'd confront whatever it was. He couldn't go on pretending that he wasn't being haunted. He would go to the cemetery, find that gravestone, and dig beneath it if he had to. Maybe then the voice would stop. Maybe then he'd finally find peace. It was past midnight when he grabbed a flashlight and an old shovel from his garage, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped his fingers around the handle. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the cemetery gate, the wind whispering through the trees as if mocking his resolve. For a brief moment he hesitated, questioning his sanity. But the relentless, invisible pressure on him pushed him forward, pulling him toward that gravestone like an unseen force guiding his every step. As he entered the cemetery, the air grew thick and cold, far colder than it should have been on an autumn night. The mist hung low over the ground, curling around the gravestones and casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move as he walked past. He felt a strange compulsion, a magnetic pull leading him directly to the grave that had haunted his every thought. It was as though he were in a trance, his footsteps muffled against the soft earth, the only sound his own breathing echoing in the silence. The night was so still that it felt as if the world itself were holding its breath, watching, waiting. Finally, he reached the gravestone, and a wave of nausea rolled over him as he recognized the faint vibration, the low hum, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. His own name seemed to echo around him, softer now, but somehow more menacing, filling the air like a chant. Without hesitating, he drove the shovel into the ground, his hands moving with a desperation he didn't fully understand. Each scoop of earth felt heavy, not just physically but as if he were digging up something ancient, something that should never have been disturbed. The earth was damp and cold, clinging to the shovel in his hands as he dug deeper and deeper. As he worked, the whispers grew louder, echoing around him in a cacophony of hisses and murmurs. Owen, Owen, Owen. The sound wrapped around him, filling his ears and seeping into his bones, urging him to dig faster, to reach whatever lay buried beneath. His hands ached, his muscles straining, but he couldn't stop. He was lost in the madness of it, driven by a need he couldn't explain. And then the shovel struck something hard. The sound was sharp, a dull thud that reverberated up the handle and into his hands, snapping him out of his trance for a moment. He paused, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and grim anticipation. With trembling hands he set the shovel aside and knelt down, scraping away the remaining earth with his fingers until he uncovered the top of a wooden coffin, its surface worn and splintered with age. For a heartbeat, he considered leaving. The rational part of him screamed to stop, to run, to forget he had ever come here. But the whispers were louder now, filling his mind until he couldn't think of anything else. His hands moved on their own, gripping the edge of the coffin lid and prying it open with a strength he didn't know he had. The lid creaked, the sound splitting the silence, and he held his breath as he lifted it. Inside there was nothing but darkness at first. And then he saw it, a shadowy figure lying within, its face obscured but unmistakably human. The figure's chest rose and fell in a slow, shallow rhythm, and suddenly its eyes shot open, hollow and dark, like two bottomless pits that seemed to pull him in. Before he could react, the figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand closing around his wrist with an iron grip. Owen screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip only tightened, dragging him down toward the open coffin. His vision blurred, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of fear and panic as he felt himself being pulled into the darkness. The air around him grew colder, thick with the stench of decay and rot, and the world faded into a black, swirling void. The next thing he knew, he was running, his feet pounding against the ground, the sound of his breath ragged in his ears. He had no memory of how he'd escaped the coffin, no memory of leaving the cemetery. All he knew was that he was running, blindly, his surroundings a dark blur as he stumbled through trees and underbrush. Branches clawed at his face and arms, the rough ground tearing at his shoes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was driven by an instinctive, primal terror, the knowledge that something was chasing him, something he couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of his being. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually his strength gave out and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The forest was silent, unnaturally so, as if every creature, every leaf, every blade of grass was watching him. He felt disoriented, his mind clouded with fragments of memories he couldn't piece together. He looked down and his heart stopped. On his head was a pumpkin. It sat snugly, encasing his head in its hollow shell, carved with a grotesque, jagged grin that seemed to mock his fear. He reached up, trying to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. The more he struggled, the tighter it seemed to cling, as if it were a part of him now, fused to his skin. He clawed at it, his fingernails scraping against the rough, orange surface, but it was no use. The pumpkin wouldn't move. His breathing grew frantic, echoing inside the hollow space, and he could feel the stench of rot filling his nostrils, thick and suffocating.